This is Echoes of the Lost, broadcasting from a hidden corner of a broken world. If you're hearing this, you might be one of the few still holding on. What follows is the tale of a survivor, or at least someone who fought to be one. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment if you're out there, clinging to hope. Now let's step into the story. I'll never forget the night everything shifted. It was as if the earth itself slipped out from under us, leaving us dangling in a void of doubt. I worked in a gleaming high-rise, a steel and glass giant that loomed over the heart of a bustling metropolis. From my desk on the 27th floor, I used to watch the city pulse below, cars weaving through traffic, buses rumbling along, and a sea of people flowing endlessly past. That was my routine, day after day, until a sudden plague tore through the streets, and that vibrant chaos evaporated overnight. At first, the news tried to stitch together some semblance of order. Anchors with tight smiles assured us the outbreak was under control, that experts were racing to the scene, that we should all just stay calm. But their words rang hollow. We could see the truth from our perch. Yellow caution tape cordoning off entire blocks, city trucks rerouting traffic into dead ends, and signs slapped on every doorway warning of a contagion spreading faster than anyone could contain. Then, silence swallowed the city whole. The hum of life faded, and we began to suspect we might be the last ones left in this towering relic. I'm not sure how many of us were still in the building when the locks clicked shut. What started as a staff of 50 or more had shrunk to a ragged handful. Some bolted at the first whiff of trouble, darting for home or anywhere but here. Others, like me, stayed, bedding this skyscraper, with its working PCs, stocked break room, and landlines, might be our best shot at riding out the storm. That was the idea, anyway, until the cracks started showing. I woke up that first morning sprawled under my desk, the 27th floor eerily still around me. I'd pulled an all-night vigil with two co-workers, Lena and Marcus. We'd taken to sleeping in turns, too jittery to close our eyes all at once, half expecting something to tap at the frosted glass doors sealing off our floor. The power held, for now. Dim emergency lights cast long shadows down the halls, flickering every so often like a dying pulse. The air felt thick, muffled, as if the building itself was holding its breath. We hadn't heard from our families. We dialed every number we could recall, but the phones either rang into nothingness or cut to static. Cell service clung on for a bit, then sputtered out. The tower's Wi-Fi followed suit, leaving us marooned in a sea of silence. Lena paced by the windows, her gaze flicking from the barren streets below to the gray skyline beyond. Marcus kept his cool, or at least pretended to, though I could see the questions burning in his eyes. We all wanted answers none of us had. That first day, we hatched a plan: scour the floors for supplies and haul them to a central hub. The boardroom on 27 seemed perfect, spacious, one way in, and a hefty oak table we could shove against the door if push came to shove. We cataloged what we could find: canned goods, water bottles, a couple of half-stocked first aid kits. It was a tedious task, but the constant dread made it unbearable. Every time we cracked open a door, I braced myself for something awful on the other side. A sight, a sound, a shadow we couldn't unsee. The building had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual drone of traffic was gone, replaced by a stillness that pressed against my eardrums. Even the faint buzz of the overhead lights felt louder in the absence of everything else. At one point, Marcus suggested we climb to the roof for a better look at the city, maybe spot a chopper or a convoy. Lena and I nodded, clinging to the slim chance of rescue. So we headed for the stairwell. The moment we pushed open the door, a wave of heavy air hit us. Normally, that stairwell echoed with footsteps and chatter. Now, it was a tomb, each step swallowed by the void. We climbed carefully, floor by floor, until we reached the rooftop exit. A thick chain looped through the handle, padlocked tight. A small, murky window offered a peek at the sky, dark clouds churning over a city that looked more like a graveyard than a home. No lights blinked above us. No engines roared. Just an endless stretch of nothing. Defeated, we slunk back to the boardroom and took stock. We'd scraped together 12 cans of chili, 3 gallons of water, and some stale granola bars from the break room stash. It wasn't much. Worse, the tap water had started running murky, a sickly brown tint we didn't trust. We'd boil it when we could, but that hinged on the power grid holding up, a gamble we knew wouldn't last. I kept busy, counting cans, testing laptops for any flicker of a signal. Lena scribbled a list of essentials, batteries, tape, anything we could rig into tools. Marcus roamed the floors, reporting back what he found. He came back from one trip with a grim look. The lower levels were empty, he said, except for a few locked offices. But on the 24th floor, he'd spotted something. A smear of black streaking the carpet, like something heavy had been dragged through. He didn't linger on it, and we didn't press. The thought alone was enough to make us double down on securing the stairwell, blocking off anything below us, and keeping the upper floors as our shaky sanctuary. By dusk, the city outside was a ghost town. Streetlights sputtered, some dead, others twitching like they were on their last legs. Abandoned cars dotted the roads, frozen mid-flight. Every so often, we thought we saw shapes flit across distant rooftops. Maybe survivors, maybe just the wind playing tricks. We couldn't tell. That night, we set up a watch rotation, 3-hour shifts, one of us awake while the others snatched what rest they could. The 27th floor lounge, with its wall of windows, became our lookout post. From there, we could scan the neighboring towers, hoping for a flare, a beacon, anything. I took first watch, perched in a rolling chair with a flashlight and a pair of binoculars I'd scavenged from a drawer. The city sprawled out below, darker and more menacing under the night sky. The occasional blink of a busted streetlight felt more like a taunt than a comfort. About an hour in, a low thud echoed through the floor. I froze, swinging the flashlight toward the hall. Nothing moved. The sound stopped. I crouched behind a desk, ears straining. The hum of the emergency lights droned on, steady but frail. Then it came again, 2 soft thumps, like someone testing a locked door. I edged toward the corridor, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The dim glow barely pierced the shadows. For a moment, I swore I saw something dart past an open doorway. A trick of the light, maybe, or my nerves fraying. I held my ground, waiting, but the noise didn't return. After what felt like hours, I crept back to my post, eyes darting between the city and the hall. The rest of my shift passed in tense quiet. When it was time to wake Lena, I whispered what I'd heard. Her face tightened, but she just nodded, grabbing the flashlight and settling in like she was bracing for war. Dawn crept in, painting the office in a weak, gray light. It was almost soothing, a reminder that the sun hadn't abandoned us yet. Marcus said his shift had been uneventful, but Lena admitted she'd heard those same thumps once, fleeting and faint. We swapped uneasy glances, then pushed on with the day. Our next move was to raid the upper floors, executive suites, mostly, but maybe a vending machine or forgotten lunchbox lingered. It was a slim hope, and it didn't pay off. Floor 28 was a wasteland of empty desks and locked closets. Lena found a radio on one, still on, hissing static. She fiddled with the dial, pressing it to her ear, but got nothing, just white noise. We hauled it back anyway, thinking it might come in handy. By noon, we decided to test the elevators. If they worked, we could hit the parking garage, maybe scrounge something from the cars down there. It was a long shot, and risky. If the power cut out mid-ride, we'd be stuck. But we were desperate. The panel lit up, and the doors slid open. We stepped in, the soft hum of the descent feeling alien after days of silence. The garage level was a cavern of shadows, lit by flickering emergency lanterns. Rows of dusty cars stretched out, untouched. We split up, checking trunks and seats. I found a couple of water bottles, half full, and a banged-up first aid kit. Lena scored a duffel bag with some spare shirts. Marcus waved me over to a locked sedan, his face pale. I peered through the window, flashlight beam cutting the dark. A torn backpack sat on the front seat, a streak of something dark, blood, maybe, smeared across the upholstery. We backed off, not willing to smash the glass and find out more. On our way back, Marcus pointed out a metal door in the corner, leading to a street-level stairwell. Light leaked through a cracked pane. It was unlocked. We debated checking outside, but the threat of the infection loomed too large. Instead, we chained it shut, a flimsy shield against whatever might be lurking. We trudged back upstairs, our meager haul barely worth the trip. That night, the sound started again, soft taps at first, then heavier steps echoing down the hall. We killed the lights, flattening ourselves against the boardroom wall. My heart hammered as Marcus gripped a jagged piece of chair we'd sharpened into a weapon. Lena's knuckles whitened around the flashlight. The tapping turned to scraping, like something dragging across the floor. It faded after agonizing minutes, leaving us trembling in the dark. When we dared to look, the hall was empty. Except for a toppled fern near the elevators, soil streaked across the carpet like a trail. We retreated, piling chairs against the door, and waited for morning, wondering how long our fragile hold on this tower could last. The second night in the tower stretched longer than the first, each minute heavy with the weight of what we couldn't see. After those eerie footsteps faded and we found that toppled fern, sleep became a distant dream. The three of us, me, Lena, and Marcus, huddled in the boardroom, our makeshift fortress on the 27th floor. The air buzzed with unspoken fears, and the dim emergency lights flickered like they were mocking our fragile grip on safety. We'd piled chairs against the door, but it felt more like a gesture than a defense. Morning arrived, weak and gray, seeping through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city outside looked even deader than before. Streetlights hung dark, cars sat like tombstones, and a thin haze clung to the skyline. We barely spoke as we took stock of our supplies. 8 cans of chili, 2 gallons of water, and a scattering of granola bars. The murky tap water still trickled out, but the sight of it turned my stomach. We'd been boiling it on a hot plate scavenged from the break room, but the power was faltering, and we knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Marcus broke the silence, his voice low. "We can't just sit here waiting for the lights to die." He'd been restless since his trip to the lower floors, that dark smear on the 24th still haunting him. Lena nodded, chewing her lip as she stared out at the empty streets. "Maybe there's a way to signal someone," she said. "The roof again, or the garage. Something's got to give." I didn't have a better idea, so we agreed to split the day, gather what we could from the upper floors, then figure out our next move. We started with floor 28 again, hoping we'd missed something the day before. The executive suites were a maze of glass partitions and leather chairs, all coated in a thin layer of dust. Lena poked through a desk and found a pocket knife. Dull, but better than nothing. Marcus kicked at a locked closet door, but it held firm, and we didn't have the energy to force it. I found a half-empty pack of batteries, still in their plastic shell, and tucked them into my bag. It wasn't much, but every scrap felt like a lifeline. Then Lena froze, her hand hovering over that radio we'd grabbed yesterday. It was still on, hissing faintly. She twisted the knob again, ear pressed close, but the static didn't yield. "If there's anyone out there broadcasting, they're not reaching us," she muttered, setting it down with a sigh. We dragged it back to the boardroom anyway, a flicker of hope we couldn't quite let go of. The silence around us was deafening, the kind that makes every creak of the building sound like a threat. By midday, a new sound broke through, a low, pulsing beep, faint but persistent, echoing from somewhere below. It wasn't the footsteps from last night, but it set my nerves on edge all the same. Marcus tilted his head, listening. "Generator, maybe? If it's dying, we're screwed." Lena grabbed her flashlight. "We should find it. If we can keep it running, We buy ourselves time. I didn't argue. Time was the one thing we couldn't afford to lose. We ventured into the stairwell, the air cool and stale against our skin. The beep grew louder as we descended, a rhythmic pulse guiding us down to the 23rd floor. The lights flickered more often now, casting jagged shadows across the walls. We followed the sound to a maintenance room tucked behind the elevator bank, a dented metal door with a high-voltage sign bolted to it. The handle wouldn't budge. Marcus rummaged through his bag and pulled out a screwdriver we'd found earlier, jamming it into the lock. After a few tense minutes, the door gave way with a groan. Inside, the room was a tangle of wires, switches, and a hulking generator in the corner. Its control panel blinked erratically, one red light pulsing like a heartbeat. The beep matched its rhythm, a warning we didn't need explained. "Fuel's almost gone," Lena said, peering at the gauges. None of us knew how to fix it. None of us even knew where to find fuel if we could. Our best shot was to conserve what little power remained. We flipped breakers to kill the lights on every floor but ours, plunging the tower into deeper darkness. It felt like sealing off pieces of our world, but it might stretch the generator another day. We hauled ourselves back to 27, exhaustion settling in. Marcus slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. "If that thing quits, we're blind down here." Lena didn't respond, just stared at the ceiling like she could will the power to hold. I busied myself sorting our supplies again, counting cans like a ritual. 8 left, 2 gallons of water. The numbers didn't lie. We were running out faster than we could plan. That afternoon, Marcus started coughing, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the quiet. He waved it off. "Just dust," he said, but his face was pale, and his hands shook when he reached for water. Lena shot me a look, worry creasing her brow. We set aside an extra sip for him, though it meant tightening our own rations. The air felt heavier, like the tower itself was pressing down on us. Then, a new sound jolted us upright. Shouts, faint and distant, drifting up from the lower floors. "Help!" someone cried, the word sharp and desperate before it dissolved into silence. We froze, glancing at each other. "Could be a trick," Marcus rasped, his voice strained. Lena gripped the pocket knife. "Or it could be someone like us." My gut twisted. Ignore it, and we'd be abandoning them. Follow it, and we might walk into something we couldn't handle. After a tense debate, Lena and I decided to check it out. Marcus stayed behind, too weak to argue, propped against the boardroom table with the radio for company. We took the stairwell, flashlights slicing through the gloom. The air grew thicker as we descended, dust clinging to every breath. Floor 24 was quiet. Floor 23, the same. Then, on 22, a sob echoed down the hall. We eased the door open, beams dancing over scattered papers and tipped over chairs. At the far end of the corridor, a figure slumped against the wall, a man, disheveled and trembling. I recognized him vaguely. Ethan, from payroll, one of the ones who'd vanished when the chaos hit. His eyes widened as we approached, flickering with relief or fear. I couldn't tell. "You're still here," he croaked, voice cracking. He rambled about the outbreak, about people turning feral, about something stalking the floors. He lifted his sleeve, showing a shallow gash on his forearm. "Got it escaping," he said, insistent. "Not from them." We helped him up, his weight sagging against us as we guided him back to the stairwell. Every creak of the floor made me flinch, half expecting shadows to lunge from the dark. Back on 27, Marcus eyed Ethan warily as we settled him into a chair. "Found him on 22nd, Lena explained. Ethan spilled more of his story between gulps of water, how he'd hidden in an office, watching groups raid the lower floors, turning on each other over scraps. "They're still out there," he whispered, glancing at the door. In the shadows. Marcus's cough worsened that night, rattling through his chest. We dug through the first aid kit, but aspirin was all we had left. Ethan took watch while we tried to rest, his flashlight beam jittering across the hall. I drifted in and out of sleep, jolted awake by footsteps, real or imagined, I couldn't say. Near midnight, Ethan nudged me awake. Heard something, he hissed, pointing toward the elevator bank. Against my better judgment, I followed him into the dark. The corridor was pitch black, our lights barely denting it. A faint scrape echoed ahead, like nails on tile. Ethan motioned for silence, creeping forward. A door creaked open to our left, then slammed shut before we could catch it. My beam caught nothing but empty air. Ethan tried the handle, locked. We lingered, breath held, until the rustling stopped. Neither of us spoke as we retreated, but the unease clung like damp rot. Dawn broke with a flicker. The lights stuttered, dimmed, then flared back weaker than ever. The generator was gasping its last. Without power, we'd lose everything. Light, heat, the ability to purify water. Marcus looked worse, his skin clammy, his breath shallow. Ethan paced, muttering about the streets outside. Lena clutched the radio, twisting the dial again, still nothing but static. "We need a plan," I said, voice steadier than I felt. Ethan suggested the roof, signal for help, maybe spot a way out. Lena wanted to try the garage again, risk the chained door. Marcus just shook his head, too tired to choose. We settled on the roof, a last grasp at hope. If rescue was coming, it'd see us there. If not, well, we'd deal with that when it came. We spent the morning fortifying the stairwell, jamming doors shut as we climbed. Ethan carried Marcus's bag, easing his load. Lena gripped the knife, her flashlight trembling. I led, sweeping each landing for threats. Floor 28 felt different this time. An open office door revealed a trashed boardroom, papers strewn like confetti. A shuffle came from the corner. I called out, soft and cautious. No answer. Lena stepped in beside me, her light joining mine. Behind a pile of broken chairs, a figure crouched, wild-eyed, clothes torn, rocking silently. "Hey," I tried, but they flinched, a low groan escaping their lips. Bandages wrapped their arms, stained and fraying. Lena offered water, but they scrambled away, whimpering. We left the bottle and backed off. They weren't coming with us, and we couldn't force them. The roof was our last stop. The chain hung loose, half undone by someone or something before us. A gust rattled the door as we pried it free. We stepped out, the city sprawling lifeless below. Smoke curled from distant streets, and shadows flickered far off, too vague to read. Lena pulled out a mirror, angling it at the sky. Marcus slumped against an AC unit, shivering. Ethan scanned the horizon, hope fading with every passing minute. We waited, rain spitting down, as the tower groaned beneath us, a relic of a world that no longer existed. The rooftop stretched out before us, a slab of cold concrete battered by a drizzle that turned the air sharp and bitter. We'd made it to the top of the tower, the four of us, me, Lena, Marcus, and Ethan, driven by a desperate hope that something, anything, might break the silence choking the city below. The wind howled, tugging at our clothes, as we stood exposed under a sky thick with gray clouds. From up here, the metropolis looked like a husk, smoke trailing from distant blocks, streets carved with stillness, and faint shapes darting at the edges of sight, too far to tell if they were friend or foe. Lena clutched her pocket knife in one hand, the compact mirror in the other, tilting it to catch what little light pierced the gloom. She swept the beam across the horizon, a silent plea for someone to see. Marcus leaned against an air conditioning unit, his breathing ragged, his face slick with sweat despite the chill. Ethan paced near the railing, eyes scanning the skyline, while I stood by the door, flashlight flickering as the tower's power waned. We'd left a pile of junk behind us, shiny pens, a shredded jacket tied into a flag, hoping it might catch a rescuer's eye. But as the minutes dragged into an hour, that hope felt more like a delusion. The rain picked up, spotting the concrete and soaking through our thin layers. Marcus shivered violently, his coughs cutting through the wind. "We can't stay up here," I said, barely loud enough to be heard. Lena lowered the mirror, her jaw tight. "No one's coming." Ethan kicked at the railing, frustration boiling over. "Then what? Sit in that tomb till we starve." Marcus didn't answer, just sank lower, eyes half closed. We all knew he wouldn't last a trek anywhere, not like this. The tower groaned beneath us, a deep, weary sound that matched the flicker of the emergency lights still clinging to life inside. The generator was on its last gasps, and with it went our heat, our light, our thin thread of security. Ethan turned, his voice sharp. "The garage. We chained that door, but there's cars down there. One might run. We could get out." Lena hesitated, glancing at the city below. "And go where?" "You saw it. Empty streets, or worse." Marcus rasped, "Wait it out. Just a little longer." But his words lacked conviction, and we all felt the clock ticking down. I looked between them, torn. Staying meant a slow fade. Hunger, darkness, whatever lurked in the halls below. Leaving meant facing a city we didn't recognize, with Marcus fading and our supplies a pitiful handful. "The lobby," I said finally. We checked the main doors. Closer than the garage, less stairs. If it's clear, we go. If not, we fall back. It wasn't a great plan, but it was something. Lena nodded slowly. Ethan shrugged, resigned. Marcus managed a weak grunt of agreement. We gathered our scraps, 2 cans of chili, a gallon of water, the first aid kit, and started down. Ethan half-carried Marcus, his arm slung over his shoulder. Lena brought up the rear, flashlight jittering against the stairwell walls. I led, sweeping each landing with my beam, the pocket knife now in my grip. The descent felt endless, the building creaking around us like it was shedding its skin. Floor 28 was still, the trashed boardroom untouched since we'd left that trembling figure behind. I wondered if they'd moved, or if they were still curled in their corner, lost to whatever had broken them. By the time we hit the lobby, my legs ached and my nerves were raw. Sunlight spilled through the glass entrance, dust swirling in the beams. The polished floor gleamed faintly under a layer of grime, rows of chairs standing like silent sentinels from a forgotten time. At first, it seemed empty. Then a shadow shifted behind the reception desk. We froze as a figure stepped out, draped in a tattered coat, eyes wide with something between fear and surprise. They raised a hand, a shaky gesture that might have been a wave. I edged forward, voice low. "Hey, we're not here to hurt you." The figure, a woman, I realized, mumbled something too soft to catch, her words tripping over each other. She stepped aside, revealing a sliding door behind her, jammed half open with jagged glass littering the floor. Beyond it, the street glowed in sharp daylight, a world we'd only glimpsed from above. She gestured wildly, her voice rising. "Out there, trouble. People not right." We caught fragments. Hostile groups, scavengers, maybe worse. It was hard to tell truth from panic. We huddled near the entrance, the woman hovering by the desk, watching us like a cornered animal. Ethan crouched beside Marcus, who'd slumped into a chair, his breath shallow. Lena peered through the gap, knife ready. "Looks quiet," she whispered. "But that doesn't mean safe." I glanced at the woman. "You staying?" She shook her head, eyes darting to the door. "Can't. Not here." Her vagueness gnawed at me, but we didn't have time to pry. Marcus's condition sealed it. His skin was clammy, his coughs wet and labored. The first aid kit had nothing left but bandages, and our water was down to a few sips. "We go," I said, meeting their eyes. "Main doors. If it turns ugly, we retreat." Ethan nodded, helping Marcus up. Lena pushed the sliding door wider, glass crunching under her boots. I stepped through first, flashlight traded for the knife, scanning the street. The city hit us with a stillness that felt alive, watchful. Pavement stretched out, littered with abandoned cars, some doors ajar, others smashed. The air carried a faint whiff of smoke and decay. wind rustling, flyers pinned under debris. We stuck close, moving as a ragged unit. Ethan supported Marcus, whose steps faltered with every block. Lena kept watch behind, her light flicking to every shadow. I led, eyes darting between shattered storefronts and dark alleys. We hadn't gone far when voices, low and urgent, drifted from a side street. We ducked behind a rusted van, holding our breath. The sounds faded, but the message was clear: we weren't alone. We pressed on, rounding corners until we stumbled into a small plaza, a dry fountain, benches tipped over, and a patch of open ground. Marcus collapsed onto a seat, head lolling against the stone. "Just need a minute," he gasped. I handed him the last of our water, a pitiful drizzle he barely swallowed. The tower loomed behind us, its glass facade glinting in the fading light. From here, it looked hollow, a monument to a life we'd lost. Lena scanned the plaza, knife still out. "We can't stop long," she said. Ethan nodded, eyes on the horizon. "There's got to be something, shelter, supplies." I crouched beside Marcus, his pulse weak under my fingers. The day was slipping away, and we had no map, no destination, just the push to keep moving. We rested there, the quiet pressing in. Distant shapes flickered at the edges of the plaza. Wind, maybe, or eyes we couldn't see. The tower's shadow stretched over us, a reminder of the 4 days we'd spent in its grip. 4 days of dwindling food, failing power, and noises that haunted the halls. Stepping out felt like shedding a skin, but the freedom came with a cost. We were exposed, vulnerable, and Marcus was slipping through our fingers. The plaza offered no answers, just more questions. I glanced back at the tower one last time, its windows dark and unblinking. Had anyone else survived inside? Was that trembling figure still hiding, or had they followed us up and out? The silence didn't tell, and the city wouldn't either. We'd left our signals on the roof, a frail cry into the void, but no one had answered. Marcus coughed again, a wet, wrenching sound that snapped us back. "We move," Lena said, voice firm. Ethan hoisted him up, and we started again, threading through the streets. The tower faded behind us, swallowed by the urban sprawl. Every step echoed, bouncing off concrete and glass, a sound too loud in a world gone mute. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped, painting the city in shades of ash and amber. We turned a corner and froze. A barricade of cars blocked the road, tires slashed, windows smashed. Beyond it, faint voices carried on the wind, too close for comfort. Lena gripped my arm, pulling us back into an alley. We pressed against the wall, listening as the murmurs grew, then faded. "Scavengers," Ethan whispered. "Or worse." Marcus sagged against me, his weight heavier than before. The alley was narrow, cluttered with trash and broken crates. We edged through, the city closing in around us. A shattered pharmacy sign swung overhead, its promise of relief long gone. I wondered if anything remained inside: bandages, water, something to ease Marcus's pain. But the voices lingered in my mind, a warning we couldn't ignore. We found a nook behind a dumpster, a temporary shield from the open street. Marcus slid to the ground, eyes glassy. Lena checked his forehead, burning. "He's not making it far," she said, voice breaking. Ethan kicked at the wall, frustration spilling out. "We should have stayed. Fought it out in the tower." I shook my head. We'd be dead already. Starved, or whatever's in there. The city watched us, its silence a living thing. Every rustle of wind, every creak of a sign, sent my pulse racing. We were out now, no walls to hide behind, and the weight of that choice sank deep. Marcus's breath slowed, each one a countdown. We'd left the tower behind, but it hadn't let us go, not really. Its echoes followed us. The generator's beep, the scrape of unseen steps, the hush that swallowed everything we'd known. Night crept closer, and with it, the unknown. The alley swallowed us whole, its narrow walls hemming us in as night bled into the sky. We crouched behind that dumpster, a pitiful shield against a city that felt more alive in its silence than it ever had in its bustle. Marcus lay slumped against the grime-streaked concrete, his breath shallow and uneven, each one a thread unraveling. Lena knelt beside him, her hand on his forehead, her face tight with a fear she wouldn't voice. Ethan stood watch, his back to the wall, eyes darting to every flicker of shadow. I gripped the pocket knife, its dull blade a frail comfort in the dark. The pharmacy sign creaked overhead, swaying in the wind, a taunting relic of a world where help was a pill or a bandage away. Marcus's cough had turned wet, a gurgling sound that made my stomach twist. "He needs something," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. "Medicine, water, anything." Our supplies were gone. 2 empty cans, a dry jug, a first aid kit stripped to its seams. Ethan kicked at a crate, his frustration a low growl. "We're too late. Should have stayed put." I didn't argue. Part of me agreed. But the tower was a memory now, its walls no safer than this alley. The city pressed in, its hush a weight on our shoulders. Every gust of wind carried whispers, distant voices, maybe, or just the ghosts of what used to be. We couldn't stay here, exposed and cornered, but moving meant risking Marcus, who could barely lift his head. "The pharmacy," I said, nodding at the shattered storefront across the street. "If there's anything left, it's our shot." Lena's eyes met mine, uncertain but resolute. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Quick in, quick out." We waited, ears straining for those voices we'd heard earlier. The street stretched empty under the dim glow of a flickering lamp, cars frozen in their final moments. When the silence held, Ethan hoisted Marcus up, his arm slung over his shoulder. Lena led, knife ready, her flashlight cutting a thin path through the dusk. I followed, scanning the shadows, every step a gamble. The pharmacy's glass doors hung off their hinges, shards crunching underfoot as we slipped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint tang of spilled chemicals. Shelves stood toppled, their contents looted or scattered, empty bottles, torn wrappers, a smashed register. Lena swept her light over the chaos, searching. I moved to the counter, hoping for a back room, a forgotten stash. Ethan eased Marcus onto a stool near the entrance, his breathing a labored rasp. "Hang on," he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. Behind the counter, a door hung ajar, leading to a storage closet. I nudged it open, flashlight trembling in my grip. Boxes lined the walls, most ripped apart, but a few were intact. I tore into one, gauze, a cracked bottle of antiseptic, and miracle of miracles, a half-full pack of antibiotics. "Lena," I called, keeping my voice low. She rushed over, prying the pack open with shaky hands. "It's something," she said, relief cracking her tone. We grabbed a dented water bottle from the floor, murky, but better than nothing, and headed back. Marcus swallowed the pills with a grimace, the water barely wetting his lips. "Thanks," he croaked, his voice a ghost of itself. We waited, hoping for a spark, but his eyes stayed dull, his body limp. The pharmacy offered no warmth, no safety, just a brief pause in the inevitable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken doors. Then, a new sound, a low shuffle, boots on pavement, close and closing in. We killed the lights, ducking behind the counter. Ethan peered through a gap, his jaw tight. "3 of them," he whispered. "Carrying bags. Looters, maybe." Their voices drifted in, gruff, clipped, arguing over something they'd found. My pulse hammered as their shadows stretched across the street, edging nearer. Lena gripped Marcus's arm, pulling him lower. I clutched the knife, its weight useless against numbers. The footsteps paused, then shifted away down the block. We held our breath until the silence returned, thicker than before. "We can't stay," Lena said, her voice firm. "They'll circle back." Ethan nodded, lifting Marcus again. Back to the alley, then figure it out. We slipped out, retracing our steps, the city's eyes on us from every dark window. The alley felt smaller now, a trap tightening around us. Marcus sagged against the wall, his breath slowing. Lena checked his pulse, her face crumpling. "He's fading," she said, barely above a whisper. Ethan punched the dumpster, a hollow clang echoing. "We dragged him out here for nothing." I shook my head, though doubt gnawed at me. We had to try. Night settled fully, stars hidden by clouds and smoke. The tower was a distant silhouette, its glass face a faint glint against the black. 4 days we'd spent there. 4 days of flickering lights, dwindling cans, and footsteps that never showed their source. Out here, the silence was different, vaster, crueler, a canvas for every fear to paint itself. Marcus's eyes fluttered shut, his chest still for too long between breaths. Lena pressed her fingers to his neck, then pulled back, tears streaking her face. "He's gone." The words landed like a stone. Ethan turned away, fists clenched. I stared at Marcus, his stillness a mirror to the city around us. We'd fought to keep him with us, but the tower, the streets, the plague, something had claimed him anyway. "We can't leave him here," Lena said, voice breaking. Ethan grabbed a tarp from the alley's debris, draping it over him. "Best we can do." I nodded, numb, as we tucked him into the shadows, a final act of care in a world that offered none. We stood there, the three of us, lost in the quiet. The alley stretched back to the plaza, the tower beyond it a fading memory. "What now?" Ethan asked, his tone flat. Lena wiped her eyes, gripping the knife. "We keep moving. For him, if nothing else." I glanced at the pharmacy, then the street ahead. "There's a clinic a few blocks north. Might be picked clean, but it's a chance." They nodded, and we started again, footsteps soft against the pavement. The city unfolded around us, a labyrinth of ruin. Shattered storefronts gaped like wounds, cars rusted in their graves. Every corner held a threat, distant shouts, a clatter of metal, shadows that might have been alive. We dodged them all, weaving through alleys and back streets, the clinic a fragile beacon in our minds. The silence wasn't peace. It was a predator, stalking us with every step, waiting for us to falter. We reached the clinic at dawn, its doors boarded but cracked open. Inside was chaos. Overturned gurneys, spilled files, a stench of mold and despair. We scavenged what we could, a bottle of water, a roll of bandages, a single protein bar. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Lena taped her knife to a broken broomstick, a makeshift spear. Ethan pocketed the bar, his face hard. I held the water, its weight a promise we'd stretch thin. The tower was gone from sight now, lost behind the sprawl. I thought of its halls, the generator's dying beep, the scrape of unseen things, the hush that followed when the lights blinked out. For days of that silence had carved us hollow, and stepping into the city hadn't filled the void, it had widened it. We'd left Marcus behind, left the trembling figure on 28, left the signals on the roof for a rescue that never came. The clinic's windows framed a gray morning, the city stretching endless and empty. "Think anyone's still in there?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the tower's direction. I shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just echoes now." Lena tightened her grip on the spear. "Doesn't matter. We're here." We stepped back into the street, the clinic at our backs, the unknown ahead. The silence followed, a companion we couldn't shake. Every rustle of wind stirred images, watchers behind dark panes, footsteps in locked corridors, a world crumbling one whisper at a time. I remembered the rooftop, staring out at a skyline that offered no answers, and realized silence wasn't just absence. It was everything that came after. Our story in the tower was over, but the city held more. We moved on, guided by a thread of trust, a resolve to keep walking even when the path dissolved. The streets swallowed us, their stillness a chorus of unease. Creaking signs, dripping pipes, the hum of a world that once was. We never learned the plague's full tale, never knew if help reached that rooftop after we left, or if the tower stood dark, a monument to what we'd lost. That was our 4 days. 4 days of quiet that stretched into forever. 4 days that ended with a leap into the abyss. I carry that silence still, a weight in every step, a reminder of when the noise of life faded and left us to find our own. That's the end of Echoes of the Lost. But don't think the nightmare's over. If you're still listening, subscribe, comment, keep the signal alive. In a world this quiet, the real terror starts when the echoes stop.